Welcome to Digging for Truth, sponsored by the Associates for Biblical Research and WBPH TV 60. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith. Associates for Biblical Research, ABR, has been doing research on archaeology in the Bible since 1969. With offices in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, the ABR ministry exists to demonstrate the historical reliability of the Bible and to equip the global church of Jesus Christ with answers to challenges that come against the truth of the Scriptures and the Gospel. We've conducted extensive research on the cities of Jericho and Ai, the Israelites in Egypt, and most recently, we are conducting archaeological excavations at biblical Shiloh. These excavations began in 2017 and are being directed by Dr. Scott Stripling, ABR staff member, professional archaeologist, and provost of the Bible Seminary in Katy, Texas. Dr. Stripling has over 20 years of field and academic experience in the world of archaeology. Scott joined us in the studio for a two-part roundtable discussion about the amazing site of biblical Shiloh. Please join us after the short break for part one of that great conversation.
We're here today to talk about Shiloh. And so we're going to talk about its significance. And Scott, we're going to jump right into this conversation today. If you can give us a little background about why Shiloh is so important.
Well, thanks, Scott, for asking that question because it's actually my favorite topic, so there's nothing that I would rather talk about. Shiloh is critically important because it's one of those conquest era sites that has the potential to answer some of the big chronological issues that we have. When did Israelites arrive? The biblical date says that they're arriving around 1406, which puts them arriving at Shiloh in the early 14th century, maybe 1399 or thereabouts. Do we have confirmation of that in the archaeological record? And if so, then can we extrapolate that out and look at the other critical sites? For example, we just found a few weeks ago a large mud brick superstructure that had collapsed at Shiloh from on top of the Bronze Age wall and was laying on top of the glacis, creating a ramp up into the city. Well, of course, this immediately brings to mind Jericho, where we have the exact same thing, red mud brick on top of a glacis forming a ramp up into the city.
Mm-hmm. What's a glacis?
Okay, so a glacis is an earthen embankment, and it is designed to protect the foundations of the fortification system. So you build this big fortification system, but an enemy then could dig it out. If there happened to be a river nearby, like Cyrus did at Babylon, I mean, Cyrus redirected the Euphrates River and undermined the walls, and that's how he took the city. So this glacis then protects the foundations, and it also creates sort of a gravity barrier so that an enemy's having to go up that slope in order to get to the city as well.
So it's a twofold purpose, fortifications. And this is built all by the Canaanites, right, before the Israelites entered the land.
Right.
So they built these massive cities all over the place in Israel.
Well, in what we would call MB2C or MB3 period, there's a big boom in the southern Levant, and we see massive construction at that time. And in the hill country where we are, where Shiloh is located, these would actually, the Bible would call them Amorites, which would be kind of a class of Canaanites, if you want to think of it that way.
So when we're thinking about digging at a site like Shiloh, we got a number of important things there, right? So we have the material culture, like you were just discussing, the fortifications, understanding that. But let's talk about the cultural, the material background. But let's talk a little bit about what most people think of at Shiloh, and that's the tabernacle. Sure. So if you could talk about that, because there's a lot to say about that.
Yeah, let's make no mistake about it. Shiloh is important because of the tabernacle.
Right.
Yes, Joshua was from the tribe of Ephraim, and that's probably why the tabernacle gets set up there. But what is the tabernacle, and why does it matter? The tabernacle is a sacred tent. It forms a temenos, and inside there is an altar. And that altar is the means by which people can restore their relationships with each other and with God. And that's what sacrifice gives us. It gives us an opportunity to restore broken relationships. It's not clean, it doesn't smell good, it's not pretty, but it covers sin. And it deals with this most basic issue that I think probably all of the listeners have. How do I connect with God? And how do I reconnect with other people? Do we have evidence that there was a tabernacle at Shiloh and that there was a sacrificial system? I believe we do. We have a material culture that is very rich in animal bones from the biblical sacrificial system, including a bone deposit in Area D that's massive. It's full of late Bronze Age pottery and bones from the biblical sacrificial system. We're now finding some key elements that also indicate that there was a sacrificial system going on.
So these animal bones, we dug at a different site before. Kerbet El Makader was I, and I remember occasionally finding bones. Now I'm a supervisor. I work under you, and you're training me, and I'm learning about this. I've worked two seasons now, bags and bags of bones. At least in the area that I've worked in, bag of bones, I guess is the thing. Let's talk about that a little bit, because is this expected? Is this unusual? What are your thoughts as an archaeologist on that?
The volume of animal bones surprised me. Comparing what I had excavated at other sites, I was taken aback by the quantity within those key loci, because when we're talking about, like, our stratum 7 is the Amorite pre-Israelite period, then our stratum 6 is the late Bronze Age, and that's where we expect to see the transition. And then our stratum 5 would be the Iron 1 period of the Judges. So do we see a change in the type of bones between these various strata?
Right.
And the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Interestingly, we have in our stratum 7, we have about 4% pig bone. And in our stratum 6 and our stratum 5, we have about 1% pig bone. And so that's a significant shift in how people are dealing with dietary issues and sacrificial issues.
Fascinating. So, and obviously in the Levitical system, the Israelites aren't allowed to eat pigs.
Right.
I mean that seems obvious to us, but as the audience is watching, this is the kind of thing that we're going to be looking for in the archaeological record.
Right.
Are the Israelites following the commands of God in the Old Testament law?
That's right.
Something we talked about yesterday, Scott, was, when you think of the tabernacle, you're thinking of an animal skin tent-like structure, and people would just assume, well, that would all be gone, obviously, by now. So what exactly are you looking for?
Well, we're not actually looking for the tabernacle. We're exposing we're exposing whatever is there, and we want to document it correctly. However, we are finding things that do point to the presence of a sacrificial system, and if there is evidence of the Mishkan, what would we expect that to be? I mean, the Danish had the same question in the 1920s, Finkelstein in the 1980s. Were very interested in evidences of the tabernacle, so I think that's a fair question. The Bible talks about clasps or rings. They're silver, they're gold, and they're bronze. We have sockets for the tabernacle where the poles go down into sockets, and they're made of these different materials too. So while the animal skins that form the curtains of the tabernacle, we certainly don't expect them to survive in the wet hill country, and we don't expect the wooden beams to survive. It's not beyond the realm of possibility that these clasps and these sockets would survive. Another interesting thing, Scott, is that in 1 Samuel you get a change in language where you've been talking about the curtains of the tabernacle. Now the Hebrew begins to talk about more permanence, delet in Hebrew, the doors of the tabernacle. So now we're getting language of permanence by what we would call the Iron 1 period, or the period of the Judges. So the possibility exists that there literally was a building of the tabernacle, which would really be a temple, but a building of the tabernacle that was constructed at Shiloh. And so we are open to that possibility as well.
Yeah. Now, I just wanted to, you used the word temenos a couple minutes ago. The temenos is a sacred area.
Right.
Just for people who've never heard that term before.
Sure. It's an area that is set apart. Let's say a miracle took place there. When Abraham took his son Isaac and he bound him on Mount Moriah, and a miracle happened there, God's provision, that spot became a temenos, a sacred spot that later people took pilgrimages back to that spot. Later, Solomon's temple is built there because it is a temenos, a sacred spot. I see Shiloh as the whole site as being a temenos, because I believe the tabernacle was portable and it moved around if and until a permanent building was built. I think they saw the whole site as sacred, and I don't think they begin to build houses for themselves until Yahweh moves into a house.
Yeah, very good.
So we're talking about what's interesting in archaeology, because the biblical text gives us, it's a long period of time. What, 300 plus years?
Sure, over 3 centuries.
Right, so we got over 3 centuries of sacrificial activity taking place, and the priesthood is obviously at least residing there or residing locally. So we've got a lot of time period to dig through. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Right, and I mean, you certainly know this. In your square, you've reached bedrock, and so you went down through, we removed a large Byzantine wall on the top of your square, you'll remember.
Right, church period, that's a church era.
Right, say 5th century BC, but a large wall that we removed. And at the time, I think you thought you had a dud of a square, but it turned out to be far from that.
That's true.
And so then we got down into early Roman 1st century material, and then down into Iron II, the period of the kings of Israel, and then Iron I, the period of the judges, and then we got into the Bronze Age, and then we found this incredible wall, this massive Bronze Age wall. We took it all the way down to bedrock, and abutting your wall was this glacis. So yeah, there's a lot of material to go through, and as we do, we're recording the bone in each locus, how the pottery shifts. We're taking carbon samples for dating, and so we're doing very careful archaeology so that then we can date the strata and see how that matches what we would expect it to be.
Yeah, I could say to the audience how exciting it is to be, to be part of it when, because I'm not a professional archaeologist, but, learning and being in the field of, as you're going down through the experience of thinking about the different periods and the different artifacts we found. So now I'm going to get something out here for you, Scott. This is an oil lamp, all right? And in my square, we found part of one. All right. So talk about the oil lamp a little bit, generally speaking, and sort of these are the kind of artifacts that we find, and how cool it is for us to discover them and for volunteers.
Well, absolutely. The pottery is always diagnostic. If we can see the curvature, especially the rims, then we can use it for dating purposes. Lamps are really helpful because we have a clear typology. We know what the lamps look like in each time period. This is sort of a transitional from late bronze to Iron I type of a lamp. It's a sort of a bowl saucer. They pinch more when you get into Iron II, the period of the kings. It pinches in a bit more. And I think you've got a bigger one over there, don't you? This would be more of a middle bronze lamp, this quad. So this is stylistic, and thousands of these have been found at sites, and they're in a certain strata. And so this is another means of dating. We can follow that typology. If we found this in a different, out of context, then we would assume something has happened in antiquity that has shifted that. The type of wheel making, like for example in the early bronze we have the slow wheel. In the middle bronze, when this is made, we have the fast potter's wheel that develops. So is it wheel made, is it mold made, is it handmade? All these things are indicative and they're important to us. But you might think of like when David says, your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. He's not talking about that. This is more what David is picturing.
And not a lamp like, we think of a lamp. This is why the material culture from archaeology is so helpful. You think of a lamp, you think of it modern, maybe carrying a lamp or something like this, but this is just enough.
Now, actually, you bring up a very interesting question. If you would have asked me that 2 years ago, I would have just agreed with you immediately. But I have now found lanterns, ceramic lanterns.
Is that right?
And where they were, if you're walking around, for example, especially, let me have the smallest lamp over there. This is more of a 1st century size. So Jesus talks about the virgins go out and they've lit their lamps. If you're walking around carrying this, you're going to be spilling hot oil. On your hands, so you're not going to go out to meet the bridegroom carrying this. It would be impossible not to be jostling it, and the wick would be. So now we have actually found lanterns.
Is that right?
And so a ceramic lantern would hold several lamps. So inside the house, of course, you can just set this down and it's on a niche. But if your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light to my path, then did they have lanterns? And now we've actually seen these lanterns.
Oh, is that right? So I stand corrected.
Well, but again, this is what we love about archaeology.
Yes, it's wonderful.
Is as I learn something new every day. It's just so vast, and this is why we want to always stay open to all the possibilities.
Or our application, how we apply this to the biblical text and how we can help people in the church understand it.
Well, these artifacts are wonderful, and there's so many more we could talk about, right? Let's talk a little bit, Scott, about those who excavated at Shiloh prior to when ABR's dig began there. And did they find anything that was related to the Bible at all?
Yes, the Danish felt like they found storage rooms that could have pertained to storage for the tabernacle. As far as anything specifically that they knew was tabernacle, no. However, based on some new research that we have done and our excavation that just concluded 2 weeks ago, we now know that they found some things that they didn't realize that they had found.
Yeah.
Shall I go ahead and get into that?
Well, we can.
Let's do it.
We certainly can.
Well, probably our number one find from this last season was a ceramic pomegranate. Now, the pomegranate is about 20 centimeters high, and it has 4 of the 5 prongs coming off the bottom of it. This is a motif of the tabernacle. I mean, the Bible is very, very clear. And then later in the temple. And we've got many scriptures that talk about this. It's a common motif in art as well, in maybe Judeo-Christian art. But the actual pomegranate is rare. Now, we've only begun the research process, and I'm working on a peer-reviewed article on this right now because it's pretty critically important. But I think this pomegranate and where we found it is going to be very important, because now we're at a site with this rich matrix of animal bones where we now begin to have things like pomegranates show up. One that comes to mind is Yokneam in northern Israel. They have a pomegranate. Well, that's a Levitical site in the Bible. And so now with this pomegranate, just the very initial research, we looked back at the Danish report, their final excavation report, and their object number 100, they had found the same thing, but the bottom part was broken off.
Okay.
And they thought it was a stopper. They labeled it as a stopper, which if I'd never seen a ceramic pomegranate before, that's what I would have probably called it too. So did the Danish find anything? Yes, but they may not have realized what they found at the time.
And that was back in the 20s?
The 20s and early 30s.
That was a long time ago.
That's right.
This new discovery of the new pomegranate is significant.
Well, it's right. It's now we know that we have 2 pomegranates from Shiloh, no telling what all we're going to find in the seasons ahead. We're also going through and beginning to sift their old dump piles, because a lot of their material wasn't even dry sifted, not to mention wet sifted. And so in our probes that we did this year of their dumps, I mean, they were just full of stone vessels and actual inscriptions, glyptic material that they had missed. And so we're going back through that.
So part of the work of what we're doing, I mean, it's really a vast task, not only digging in the present, but also engaging with what's been done before.
Right.
And then because all the archaeology has improved so much and there was limitations to what they could do, we're going back and going through this material. So it's really a substantial task to do it right.
That's right. And the wet sifting, you might think, well, the material's out of context. It's already been dug and dumped. What value can you get? Well, we uncovered a sherd about this big, a body sherd. And sometimes people grumble, Henry, you may not believe this, but sometimes people grumble about having to wash all of this pottery. And I make them wash anything that's this size of a $50 or smaller. And you'll often hear people express an opinion that, this is a lot of work and it's a waste of time. But then when we get returns like this on this body sherd, it has a hunting scene on it. That same sherd, you may not have even heard this yet, that same sherd was found in 2 previous excavations, in the Danish excavation and in the Finkelstein excavation, in context, but they didn't have the whole inscription. They just had part of the motif of the hunting scene. So now we have the rest of it. So even though it was not in context, it still enables us to then finish completing that picture.
Yeah, and when you say sifting, we're talking about going back through the material that they dug and dumped and sifting it, going through it. And then talk about the wet sifting a little bit, because that's such an important part of what we do.
This season, we wet sifted about 90% of our material, and this is just phenomenal. Last season we were able to do about 50%, but with our new and improved high-tech wet sifting station, we were able to do about 90% of the material. And so after it's been dry sifted, then it's checked a second time at the wet sifters. From our wet sifting, we found, well, in the dry sifting, the pomegranate and other things like this come out of that. But then it's checked even further. And once it's washed, we found 2 scarabs, we found the bula, coins, beads, just all kinds of rich archaeological material. And you think about all the trouble we go to, the cost and all the trouble to do this excavation, and then to think that we would be missing critical pieces of information is just, the truth is, in the past we have and everyone else has. But now that we know better, we can do better. Yeah.
So some other goals that we have at Shiloh in terms of the overall objective. Obviously, we're looking at the tabernacle, evidence of the sacrificial system. But talk about some other big picture things that you're thinking about, how the site maybe relates to the region and that kind of thing. Just share with the audience the importance of all that.
Well, if I can go back to Scott's question for a second, did Finkelstein have evidence of the sacrificial system? Yes, also storage rooms and that big bone deposit that we were talking about in Area D. So I think the previous digs did have clear evidence. Now, what are some of our larger macro goals, and how does it relate regionally? To me, that's the key. Is I'm always telling square supervisors, you have to think outside your square. But then we also have to think outside of our site. Like, how does Shiloh fit into a larger settlement pattern? Do we see these same trends? The Bible gives us a list of cities that are either conquered and or settled or come under Israelite control around the same time. Do we see that same pattern taking place in the material culture? If we were to look at Jericho and Ai and Mount Ebal and Shiloh, would we find similarities? And the answer is yes.
So part of your objective as an archaeologist is not only to examine Shiloh per se, but you have to be familiar with what's going on regionally in other archaeological digs and what the biblical text is telling us, because sometimes there's a conflict with what the archaeologists are saying versus the Bible. So this is no simple task.
Well, the volume of reading is huge. Just to stay up with the journals and all the information on all the digs is a challenge in and of itself. It's exciting at times, but it's also just a large volume of reading. I'll give you one example. At Jericho, there's some discussion about how the walls of Jericho fell. How can Shiloh help us understand that better? Well, our wall was built at the same time that the Jericho wall was built. We had a red mud brick superstructure. Finkelstein had not found, but now we have proof of it. And ours collapsed the same way that Jericho's did, and it created a ramp the same way that Jericho's was created. So by comparing these parallels, we can understand what happened at a different site from actually understanding our site. So it's a form of processualism, or understanding a larger perspective.
It's excellent. I think one of the things that strikes me as going into the field, not being a professional archaeologist, but working with ABR for a long time, is connecting to the land of the Bible and seeing how God has acted in history. Seeing these incredible connections, that pomegranate, it created such a buzz at our site this year, and it was really exciting.
Yeah, well, we're excited to publish that, to get the word out, and as soon as we get it out in a peer-reviewed journal, we plan to get it in Bible and Spade and get it out to our ABR audience as well.
Thank you for joining us today in our episode of Digging for Truth, where we discussed the city of biblical Shiloh and our excavations there, sponsored by the Associates for Biblical Research. We're grateful that you joined us for the program. As you can see from our conversation with Dr. Stripling, there are many factors that go into an archaeological excavation, and there's much to be considered. The biblical text, the archaeological discoveries, the cultural background, and the bigger picture of the archaeology in Israel. We hope that you have come to understand the importance of archaeology and why it helps us to understand the Bible, how it's used as a tool to defend the Scripture's historicity, and why archaeology is so important. If you're interested in joining us, visit our website, www.digshiloh.org, and find out how you can become a volunteer, a prayer partner, or a financial supporter of the ministry and of the work that we're doing. Thank you for joining us today and for viewing our program.